June 1779. The Rock of Gibraltar. A 67-year-old British general named George Augustus Eliott looked south across the bay and watched the Spanish army arrive. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of siege guns, supply convoys stretching to the horizon. Spain wanted Gibraltar back, the rocky peninsula they'd lost to Britain 75 years earlier, and they were willing to starve, bombard, and assault 5,000 British defenders until they got it. The Spanish expected it would take months, maybe a year if the British were stubborn. They had the numbers, 53,000 troops against 5,000 defenders. They had the guns, hundreds of siege cannons against a garrison running low on supplies. They had time. Britain was fighting wars on 3 continents and couldn't possibly reinforce every distant outpost. The mathematics were simple. The outcome seemed inevitable. But the Spanish had made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that mathematics mattered more than something else. Something the British possessed that couldn't be counted in ledgers or measured in cannonballs. What happened over the next 3 years and 7 months would prove them catastrophically wrong. This is the Siege of Gibraltar, the longest siege Britain ever endured. The defense that proved the Royal Navy and British courage could hold anything, and the victory that kept the key to the Mediterranean in British hands, where it remains 245 years later. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into a siege that wasn't decided in hours or days, but in years of grinding endurance. Because Gibraltar wasn't about one dramatic battle. It was about 1,300 days of refusing to surrender when every rational calculation said you should. It was about British garrison troops proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from attacking, but from simply refusing to break. But before we get to that rock, before we watch British gunners destroy Spain's secret weapons and a geriatric general inspire starving soldiers, we need to understand why Gibraltar mattered so much. Because without knowing what this rocky peninsula represented, you can't appreciate why Spain and France threw everything they had at 5,000 British defenders for nearly 4 years. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We cover the sieges, the battles, the impossible defenses that made Britain great. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1704, when Britain captured Gibraltar during the War of Spanish Succession. The Rock, a massive limestone promontory jutting into the Mediterranean, controlled the strait between Europe and Africa, between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Whoever held Gibraltar controlled maritime traffic through this choke point. And in the age of sail, when trade and naval power determined global dominance, Gibraltar was priceless. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 formally ceded Gibraltar to Britain. Spain had lost it, and they wanted it back. For 66 years, they tried diplomacy, negotiation, and threats. Nothing worked. Britain wasn't giving up the Rock. By 1779, with Britain distracted fighting the American Revolutionary War, Spain saw an opportunity. Britain was overstretched, fighting rebels in America and protecting global trade routes. Surely they couldn't defend a small garrison on a distant rock while fighting wars on multiple continents. Spain was about to discover exactly how wrong that assumption was. The garrison commander was General George Augustus Eliott, appointed governor of Gibraltar in 1777. Eliott was 67 years old, an age when most men were retired or dead. But Eliott was no ordinary 67-year-old. He'd fought in multiple wars, studied engineering and fortification, and possessed the kind of iron constitution that made younger men look soft. He ate simple rations, vegetables and water, rarely meat or wine. He slept 4 hours a night. He personally inspected defenses daily, climbing steep paths that exhausted men half his age. His soldiers called him Old Cock of the Rock, and they meant it as the highest compliment. Eliott commanded approximately 5,000 troops, British regular regiments, Hanoverian soldiers, and some Corsican volunteers. The civilian population added another 1,500 people. Against them, Spain assembled 14,000 troops initially, growing to over 40,000 by 1782. When France joined Spain in 1782, another 13,000 French soldiers arrived. The combined Spanish-French force eventually numbered 53,000 men, surrounding a garrison of 5,000. The odds were more than 10 to 1. On June 21st, 1779, Spain formally began the siege. They sealed the land border, cutting off all supplies from the Spanish mainland. No food, no fresh water beyond what Gibraltar's wells provided, no reinforcements. The plan was simple: starve the British into submission. If blockade didn't work, bombardment would. If bombardment failed, assault. Surely one of these would succeed. The British response was equally simple: no surrender, hold the rock, trust the Royal Navy to break the blockade, endure whatever Spain threw at them until relief arrived. For the first year, it was a waiting game. Spanish guns bombarded Gibraltar from positions on the mainland and from floating batteries in the bay. British guns returned fire. Shells crashed into buildings. Civilians huddled in caves carved into the rock itself, natural fortresses that Spanish artillery couldn't touch. Soldiers manned the walls, repaired damage, and watched their food supplies dwindle. By early 1780, the garrison faced a crisis worse than Spanish guns: scurvy. Without fresh vegetables or fruit, soldiers developed the sailor's disease: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, weakness, joint pain, and eventually death. The garrison's strength began collapsing, not from combat, but from malnutrition. Men who could fight Spanish assaults were dying from vitamin C deficiency. Morale plummeted. How long could they hold? Then, in January 1780, Admiral George Rodney arrived with a relief convoy. 21 supply ships, escorted by Royal Navy warships, forced their way past Spanish naval blockades and reached Gibraltar. Fresh food, ammunition, reinforcements. The garrison erupted in celebration. Scurvy cases began recovering. Eliott's gamble that the Royal Navy would get through had paid off. The siege would continue, but British determination was reinforced. Think about this for a moment. You're a British soldier on Gibraltar in late 1779. Your gums are bleeding. Your teeth are loose. You can barely stand. Spanish guns bombard you daily. The enemy surrounds you 10 to 1. Every rational thought says, this is hopeless. Then British ships appear on the horizon, bringing salvation. How would that feel? That's why the garrison never considered surrender. They knew Britain wouldn't abandon them. Drop your thoughts in the comments. The Spanish were furious. Their blockade had failed. But they had another strategy: systematic bombardment. For months, Spanish artillery pounded Gibraltar. The garrison counted over 300,000 cannonballs fired at the rock over the siege's duration. Buildings were destroyed. The town of Gibraltar was reduced to rubble. But the garrison, living in caves, working in shifts, maintaining constant vigilance, endured. British gunners returned fire with equal intensity, firing over 200,000 rounds back at Spanish positions. In November 1781, Eliott decided endurance wasn't enough. He needed to damage Spanish siege works and show his men that British forces could still attack, not just defend. He planned the Great Sortie, a surprise assault on Spanish trenches and artillery positions. On the night of November 27, 1781, 2,000 British soldiers silently left Gibraltar's defences and advanced on Spanish positions. The attack was perfectly timed. Spanish sentries were surprised. British troops stormed trenches, destroyed gun positions, spiked cannons, and set fire to Spanish siege works. The fighting was brutal and fast. Within hours, the British withdrew back to Gibraltar, having inflicted devastating damage. Spanish casualties, over 200 killed or wounded, plus massive material losses. British casualties, 4 dead, 25 wounded. The sortie proved that British troops weren't passive defenders. They could attack, destroy, and withdraw with professional precision. Spanish morale was shattered. How could they besiege a fortress whose garrison attacked them? But Spain wasn't finished. By 1782, France had joined the siege. The Duc de Crillon brought 13,000 French troops and, more importantly, French engineering expertise. Together, Spain and France devised a secret weapon they believed would finally break Gibraltar: floating batteries. These weren't ordinary ships. They were specially designed vessels with sides over 2 feet thick, armored with layers of timber, cork, and wet sand. The designers claimed they were unsinkable and fireproof. 10 of these batteries, mounting 212 heavy guns, would approach Gibraltar, anchor close to the walls, and pound the defences at point-blank range where British guns couldn't effectively respond. It was the 18th century equivalent of tanks, seemingly invincible weapons that would change everything. The attack was scheduled for September 13, 1782, the Grand Assault. Over 400 Spanish and French ships would participate. The floating batteries would lead, supported by gunboats, mortar ships, and the combined Franco-Spanish fleet. It would be the greatest combined operation since the Spanish Armada, and Spain was confident of victory. Eliott prepared a counter-strategy. British engineers developed heated shot, cannonballs heated red-hot in furnaces, then carefully loaded into guns and fired at enemy ships. A red-hot ball that struck a wooden vessel could start fires that water couldn't easily extinguish. It was dangerous. Handling glowing metal cannonballs risked accidental explosions, but British gunners practiced until they could safely fire heated shot without blowing themselves up. September 13, 1782, dawned clear and calm. At 7 a.m., the Spanish floating batteries began their approach. The sight was terrifying. Massive armoured vessels, impervious to normal shot, advancing inexorably toward Gibraltar's walls. Spanish and French guns on shore opened fire simultaneously. Over 400 guns bombarded Gibraltar in the greatest barrage the garrison had yet experienced. The noise was overwhelming. Smoke covered the bay. British gunners opened fire with everything they had. Normal shot bounced off the floating battery's thick armor, exactly as the Spanish had predicted. For hours, the floating batteries pounded Gibraltar, while British fire seemed ineffective. Spanish officers congratulated themselves. Their secret weapon was working. Then the British heated shot began taking effect. Red-hot cannonballs smashed into the floating battery's wooden sides. The armor was thick, but wood is wood. It burns. Small fires started on one battery, then another. Spanish crews tried to extinguish the flames, but the fires spread. The supposedly fireproof vessels were burning. By afternoon, the first floating battery was clearly doomed, flames consuming it despite frantic Spanish efforts. British gunners concentrated fire on the burning ships, ensuring the fires spread. By evening, most of the floating batteries were ablaze. Spanish and French sailors abandoned ship, jumping into the water, desperately swimming for shore or rescue boats. And then, something remarkable happened. British gunboats rowed out from Gibraltar into the flaming chaos and began rescuing enemy sailors from the water. While the battle still raged, while Spanish guns still fired at Gibraltar, British sailors pulled drowning Spaniards from the bay. They saved over 400 enemy soldiers that night, men who'd been trying to kill them hours earlier. It was chivalry amid slaughter, humanity in the midst of war. By midnight, the grand assault had failed catastrophically. All 10 floating batteries were destroyed, burned, sunk, or captured. Spanish casualties exceeded 1,500 killed, wounded, or captured. British casualties: 16 dead, 68 wounded. Spain's secret weapon, years in development, had been destroyed in one day by British ingenuity and courage. The psychological blow was crushing. Spain and France had thrown everything at Gibraltar: 3 years of blockade, systematic bombardment, 53,000 troops, secret weapons, and the greatest combined assault they could muster. And 5,000 British defenders had held. Not just held, they'd destroyed the attacking force so completely that further assaults were unthinkable. On June the 21st, 1779, Spain formally began the siege. They sealed the land border, cutting off all supplies from the Spanish mainland. No food, no fresh water beyond what Gibraltar's wells provided, no reinforcements. The plan was simple: starve the British into submission. If blockade didn't work, bombardment would. If bombardment failed, assault. Surely one of these would succeed. The British response was equally simple: no surrender. Hold the rock. Trust the Royal Navy to break the blockade. Endure whatever Spain threw at them until relief arrived. For the first year, it was a waiting game. Spanish guns bombarded Gibraltar from positions on the mainland and from floating batteries in the bay. British guns returned fire. Shells crashed into buildings. Civilians huddled in caves carved into the rock itself. Natural fortresses that Spanish artillery couldn't touch. Soldiers manned the walls, repaired damage, and watched their food supplies dwindle. By early 1780, the garrison faced a crisis worse than Spanish guns: scurvy. Without fresh vegetables or fruit, soldiers developed the sailor's disease: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, weakness, joint pain, and eventually death. The garrison's strength began collapsing, not from combat, but from malnutrition. Men who could fight Spanish assaults were dying from vitamin C deficiency. Morale plummeted. How long could they hold? General Eliott returned to England a hero. He was elevated to the peerage as Baron Heathfield. His portrait, showing him pointing at the burning floating batteries, became iconic. But Eliott didn't enjoy his honours long. He died in 1790, aged 72, his health finally broken by the siege's hardships. His soldiers mourned him genuinely. He'd shared their rations, their dangers, and their triumph. From a Spanish perspective, Gibraltar was national humiliation. They'd besieged the rock with overwhelming force and failed. The financial cost, over 50 million reales, contributed to Spain's economic problems for years. And they still didn't have Gibraltar. The wound to Spanish pride never healed. Spain still claims Gibraltar today, 245 years later. Britain still holds it. The siege also demonstrated the importance of leadership. Eliott was 67 when the siege began, ancient by 18th century standards. He could have delegated, remained in his headquarters, let younger men handle the hardships. Instead, he led from the front, shared every privation, inspired by personal example. When soldiers saw their elderly general climbing steep paths to inspect defences, eating the same rations they ate, refusing luxuries he could have claimed, they found courage to endure. That's leadership, not speeches or orders, but shared sacrifice. The heated shot innovation deserves emphasis. British engineers faced a problem. Conventional cannonballs couldn't penetrate the floating battery's thick armour. Instead of accepting defeat, they innovated. Heated shot was known but rarely used, too dangerous, too unpredictable. British gunners practiced until they mastered the technique. When the grand assault came, they were ready. British victory at Gibraltar came partly from courage, but also from superior technology and the willingness to take calculated risks. Today, Gibraltar remains a British overseas territory. The population, about 34,000 people, overwhelmingly wants to stay British. A 2002 referendum asked if Gibraltar should become Spanish. The result? 99% voted to remain British. Spain still protests. The European Union still debates. But Gibraltar's people have made their choice, echoing the choice Eliott's garrison made in 1779. Britain, not Spain. The rock itself is largely unchanged. The limestone cliffs still dominate the strait. The caves where civilians sheltered still exist, now tourist attractions. The great siege tunnels, carved by British engineers during the siege to mount guns higher on the rock, remain, a testament to British engineering under pressure. And British forces still garrison Gibraltar, though modern weaponry has replaced 18th century cannons. Here's a question worth considering. Eliott could have surrendered honourably after a year. His garrison had endured bombardment, disease, starvation. No one would have blamed him. But he held for nearly 4 years because he believed Gibraltar mattered enough to justify any sacrifice. Was he right? Did one rocky peninsula justify years of suffering? Or was it stubborn pride refusing to admit defeat? Historians still debate this. What's your take? Let me know in the comments. What makes Gibraltar's siege remarkable isn't just the duration. Though 3 years and 7 months is extraordinary, it's the completeness of British victory despite impossible odds. Spain and France tried everything: blockade, bombardment, secret weapons, massive assaults. Every strategy failed against British determination, ingenuity, and the leadership of one elderly general who refused to quit. The siege proved several enduring lessons. Fortifications matter. The rock's natural strength multiplied the garrison's defensive power. Supply lines matter. Royal Navy convoys kept the garrison alive when Spanish blockade should have starved them. Leadership matters. Eliott's personal example inspired soldiers to endure hardships that would have broken lesser men. And innovation matters. Heated shot defeated technology that conventional tactics couldn't touch. Gibraltar also shows that sometimes the greatest victories aren't dramatic charges or crushing defeats. Sometimes victory is simply refusing to lose. Holding your position, enduring what enemies throw at you, surviving until enemies exhaust themselves. It's not glamorous. It doesn't make great cinema. But it works. And it's very British, stubborn, determined, utterly refusing to acknowledge when you're beaten, because acknowledging defeat means accepting it. Within decades of the siege, Britain would be fighting revolutionary France, then Napoleonic France. Gibraltar would serve as a crucial Royal Navy base throughout those wars, exactly as Eliott had ensured it would. Ships refitting at Gibraltar could control the Mediterranean, blockade French ports, support operations in Italy and Egypt. Every British naval victory in the Mediterranean from 1779 to 1815 was made possible because Eliott held Gibraltar in 1779 to 1783. If this is the kind of history that makes you proud to be British, the impossible defences, the refusal to surrender, the elderly general who shared his soldiers' suffering and led them to victory, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other forgotten British sieges should we cover? The defence that saved an empire. The soldiers who held when everyone said they should run. Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that made Britain great, told the way they deserved.